We're all set, John. John, you're on mute. John, are you able to connect to audio?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the American Geographical Society Council, our members, and the staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this 5th Location Tech Task Force Blue Ribbon Panel. Data quality and building trust, false negatives, false positives, and policing surveillance. To those of you participating in the conversation on WebEx, and those that are watching our live stream on Facebook, it's great to have you joining us this afternoon. We're proud to partner our Ethical Geo initiative with the Henry Luce Foundation to investigate the societal implications of geospatial technology and location tracking. Mobile-based location applications have become ubiquitous in our society. As all of you know, they've changed the way we live our lives in a very short period of time. There are, however, problematic and unanticipated effects of using this technology. To better understand the ethical implications of its use, we have provided this platform to frame the discussion and to address these issues as they are already impacting our lives on a daily basis. COVID-19 has put a spotlight on the concept of using mobile tracing and surveillance to fight the pandemic. Around the world, the utilization of this technology to fight the coronavirus is being employed to various degrees, and already governments and people worldwide are faced with the issue of compromised privacy and what that means as we go forward. Over the past several weeks, our first 4 Blue Ribbon panels met and looked at ethical implications of mobile location technology and the impact on vulnerable publics from an international perspective and from the unique American experience. In addition, we had a panel of national security leaders who focused on mobile tracing technology and its use in national security and democracy. And just a couple of days ago, we heard from state and local leaders who shared their invaluable experiences with us. In the case of all the panels, the discussions were eye-opening and extensive. We also had the opportunity to hear from Ambassador Samantha Power, and she added the human rights aspect of the use of mobile technology. Today, we appropriately turn our focus towards data quality and building trust, a topic noted by many of the participants in our previous panels. Over the next couple of weeks, we will continue to convene Blue Ribbon panels and leadership spotlights and collect testimony from other perspectives to serve as the basis of information and data that policymakers can use to help and guide us into the future. Before we move on, I would like to explain to those of you on our WebEx platform the best way to get the most out of today's panel. For those viewing on desktop computers or laptops, we recommend that you customize your viewing by hovering the mouse in the top right of your screen and selecting the icon in the middle. During our Q&A session later, to ask a question, hover your mouse under the arrow and click on the question mark icon in the gray bar at the bottom of your screen. For those of you using a tablet or mobile device, select the icon with the 3 dots, which will then allow you to select the question mark icon to submit your questions to our panelists. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Christopher Tucker, the chairman of AGS and our moderator for today's session. Chris, it's a pleasure to welcome you and your panel.
Thank you, John, and thank you to the team for putting this all together today. There's a lot of moving parts behind the scenes that no one ever gets to see, so thank you for your efforts. Our society, AGS, has been convening people from government, industry, academia, and the social sector for the past 169 years, since 1851, around the vital issues of the day through a geographic lens. And in both the vital issues of the day have changed vastly since 1851, in many ways, maybe in some cases not. And the nature of geospatial technology has also changed considerably over the years. Last year, we began our Ethical Geo initiative to better understand the ethical implications of geospatial data and technology on our society. And with the dawn of COVID-19 and issues of contact tracing and the new roles of location-based technologies in combating COVID-19, we partnered with the Henry Luce Foundation to help us explore the ethical implications of mobile location tech in an era of COVID-19 and beyond, particularly with an eye towards the next challenge, the next threat that will face our society. So in that context, I could not be more pleased to have our speakers that we have with us today. And let me introduce each of them before we get started. Mr. Albert Fox-Kahn is Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, STOP's founder and executive director. He's a fellow at the Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy at NYU School of Law, and a columnist for Gotham Gazette. He began STOP because he believes that the emerging surveillance technologies pose unprecedented threats to civil rights and the promise of a free society. Dr. Hyung-Ah Choi is the professor of computer science at George Washington University. Her research lab centers its activities on graph and optimization algorithms in network problems and on analysis and design of algorithms relevant to the modern massive data problems that we face. Her current projects include the development of low complexity algorithms to find underutilized wireless channels in cognitive radio networks and the analysis of modern online education content and finding optimal learning paths. Ms. Fane Greenwood does consulting work that focuses on ethically integrating new technologies into existing organizations and processes with clients including the World Bank and the American Red Cross. She is also a humanitarian technology author. As a researcher at the Signal program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, she focused on the use of unmanned aerial vehicles and spatial information in humanitarian aid. Fane is also a regular contributor to Slate and Foreign Policy. And last is Dr. Julia Stojanovic, who is assistant professor of computer science and assistant professor of data science at NYU. Her research focuses on responsible data management and analysis practices, operationalizing fairness, diversity, transparency, and data protection. She established the Data Responsibility Consortium and serves on the New York City Automated Decision Systems Task Force. So with that, I will pass it over to our first speaker. Each of our speakers will be speaking for roughly 7 to 10 minutes. And then we will move on to a discussion between our speakers, and then we'll open it up to the questions from our online audience. So again, please follow the guidance that John Konarski gave you earlier. And at any point in this presentation, feel free to upload your questions to WebEx. So again, thanks for joining us, and we'll begin by passing this over to Albert. Albert?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this conversation. And the issues we're dealing with here today involving privacy and technology and the deployment of mobile tracking in response to COVID-19 and beyond, it really could not be more important and impactful in how it will shape, decisions here in the United States and around the world. Just as a brief introduction, and if we could go to the first slide. Perfect. So I am the founder of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, an organization here in New York that fights police and state-level surveillance. It is a mix of litigation, legislation, public education, grassroots community organizing, and programs designed at trying to tackle the most destructive uses of surveillance and the ways that public surveillance can give new powers to police and to immigration officials while analyzing the unique harms that these technologies pose to historically over-policed communities. Next slide. So at STOP, we've been quite concerned about the deployment of exposure notification systems that transform individuals' smartphones into potential diagnostic tools to detect if someone has been exposed to COVID-19. We believe that this use of mass surveillance is both unproven but potentially misleading in the data it provides, and that it creates a massive new surveillance capacity. We've looked primarily at the Bluetooth API that was developed by Google and Apple, trying to analyze the privacy impacts of that data, but also its limitations, the lack of contextual data, the lack of understanding whether a phone is registering another device's proximate simply because the two individuals are in adjoining rooms or the same room. Are they outside? Are they inside? These are the contextual data points that mass surveillance won't provide us, whether it's through Bluetooth, GPS, or any other form of mass location tracking. We also are quite concerned about reliance on end user devices such as smartphones, because that can easily bake in bias by allowing us to depend on the performance of those users' devices when we know that many users, because of socioeconomic status or other factors, will be using very different phones, very different types of wearables, and this will lead to a very inconsistent and potentially discriminatory data set. Next slide. Specifically, we're concerned about the fact that we see incredibly low smartphone penetration rates among low-income elderly individuals, especially those in communities of color, creating a situation where those communities who have suffered the most under COVID-19 would potentially be least served by these exposure notification systems. We also are quite concerned by the fact that there are a variety of factors that potentially could impact the performance of Bluetooth as a proximity tracking system. Everything from housing density and housing stock to the age of the phone, power settings, whether a phone is being held in the hand or whether it's being placed in pants pockets or a purse. These factors that potentially would lead to higher rates of false positives and false negatives for the exposure notification system have the potential to replicate the sorts of bias that we've seen with AI when deployed in the law enforcement sector, as well as a number of health applications. Next slide. Crucially, we challenge the premise that these technologies are opt-in. Google and Apple in particular have highlighted the fact that a user would have to install an app and click I agree on terms of service prior to using one of the exposure notification systems. But this isn't purely a legal question. This isn't purely a technical question. It's also a legal question, because what happens if that individual is told that they will lose their job, or if they will not be able to attend school, or they won't be able to access public accommodations or mass transit without clicking that box and saying, I agree. At this, we currently don't have protections against the sort of coercion that would undermine the premise that these technologies are consensual. And when we are laying the foundation for mass coercive surveillance, it also normalizes some forms of mass surveillance that we oppose at STOP, because they are often used as a form of state power against those communities that have the least power to fight back. Next slide. And we're also quite concerned about the fact that many of the novel tracking tools that we see being deployed in response to COVID-19 have no scientific track record to actually demonstrate that they're effective. There's no peer-reviewed evidence. There's no independent evaluation. There's oftentimes, with AI-driven systems, no independent auditing for bias. And so with some of the systems we see being proposed for location tracking, It's the privacy impact and the equity impact is really just quite disturbing. One example is facial recognition. We've documented at least one college that has looked at installing facial recognition kiosks as a way of tracking students as they go around campus and using that persistent location information as a contact tracing technology. As many of you know, facial recognition is an increasingly controversial technology in part because of its demonstrated bias against communities of color, particularly darker skinned Black women. And because of the underlying errors in these technologies and because of the way they're currently being challenged, we're quite skeptical that many of the vendors that are entering the COVID-19 contact tracing space with location-based systems, whether they be biometric or whether they be a smartphone-based, are actually going to be able to live up to the promises that they're making. But crucially, these sorts of invasive systems also undermine community trust. They also erode belief in the legitimacy of contact tracing more broadly, and they potentially make it more difficult for public health authorities to use evidence-based measures such as traditional manual contact tracing, especially manual contact tracing by culturally competent individuals who are rooted in the communities where outreach is taking place. Next slide. Next slide. Well, perfect. And perhaps the most distressing concern we see in this space is the lack of protection against police misuse of data collected in COVID-19 contact tracing and as part of other public health tracking efforts. Under federal law, a bill called HIPAA, there is simply a requirement that police obtain a subpoena, not even a warrant, prior to obtaining contact tracing data. And that's only in those cases where HIPAA applies. Oftentimes when private vendors are the ones using contact tracing who are deploying these systems, HIPAA doesn't even apply that minimum threshold, meaning that firms would oftentimes be completely free to sell this information to police or to other entities without any judicial oversight. We believe that we need additional state and federal protections to ensure that public health location data is never weaponized as a policing or immigration enforcement tool. We do not believe that it can possibly serve both functions, that as soon as you begin to weaponize that data against over-policed communities, you will make it impossible to gain the community trust that is necessary to have an honest conversation about potential points of exposure and people who may have contracted COVID-19. That is why we've been part of an effort here in New York State to pass contact tracing privacy legislation that would ban police access to this data, but more needs to be done at the federal level as well, because states on their own cannot block the sort of abuse by federal law enforcement that immigrant rights groups have feared in this space for many months now. And with that, I will bring this portion to a close. Thank you again for letting me participate in this panel.
Thank you, Albert. I think that point that you ended on is just so important, and I'm looking forward to exploring it in the Q&A. You know, if contact tracing data ends up being used to kind of feed a larger over-policing regime, then people, particularly those most vulnerable, are going to be less and less willing to play a role in actually, you know, resolving these contact tracing leads. Right, they'll either not want to be contacted, or you know they're going to try to stay off the grid. So and that's kind of starting from a place of lack of trust. So I think, as we've said, found in many of our panels, it's very hard to build trust in kind of a digital trust environment, and it's so easy to tear it down. So how do we explore the nuances there? So thank you. Next, I'm going to move over to Professor Choi for her introductory comments. Professor Choi.
Hi. I'm going to briefly talk about the current technology being used and the potential direction to go. So next slide, please. So brief overview of contact trace technology is there are basically two categories. One is actively reporting geographic locations, either manually or the actively tracing by the, for example, the cellular tower can actively trace the cell phone's locations. Or the other one is the most famously by being developed by Apple and Google, which is it is like a it's not tracing exact location, rather than the two devices are within the certain proximities, then they are as a those two are within the contact, and they're using that information for further applications. Next slide, please. So in the example, the geolocation-based technology, there are some, this is currently mostly used, such as including the MIT has developed, and the North and South Dakota has developed their own app, and another application in South Korea, which I had a recent visit to South Korea, and I like to share my experience of how they are doing in the next slide. And the second technology, which is I'm going to get into it. So in the contact tracing in South Korea, now I came back from Korea last week. And I realized why they can maintain such a low cases. And basically, their contact trace and monitoring system is very strict. In a sense, I believe the SARS outbreak, which was 2002, 2003, right after that, Congress has passed a law allowing the government, in the case of a pandemic, epidemic, allowing government to completely monitor and trace the individual's data. So based on this, they can quickly act on the contact tracing issues. So for example, if a person is tested positive, then they immediately isolate the person, and then they do the just like interview, doing the contact tracing, and then verifying using the CCTV. By the way, whole entire major city is completely covered by CCTV. So they even check review the CCTV data, and to make sure what the person has been around the last few days. And even they check the person has used the credit card or with certain location at certain time, and then try to review other people who are there at the time and at the location, and that they contacted. So that's the level of contact tracing they are talking about. And then once the foreigners are arriving to the airport, then you have to sign certain agreement then, and download the app, where you're going to be assigned a certain unique ID. And then you have to be quarantined in 14 days, either government place in a government designated, or if you have a place to stay, you alone, or the traveling together family members, if they approve it, then you can stay in the location for 14 days, very strict monitoring. And then as soon as you arrive, you have to go to the nearby location to get the test. And then basically the test result was available within 12 hours. So if you are test positive, then you will be brought into a certain location, complete isolation. And if you are negative, you still have to stay in 14 days in quarantine in the location. Next slide, please. And then during the 14-day, you have to report your temperature morning and evening through the app. And if you are late, couple of hours late, you're gonna get a right away certain alarm. So you have to report it in time. And then they call you, they visit you at random time, random days, and then to make sure you are in the location. So everything is monitored through your cell phone. So what if you leave the phone? What if you take the phone outside? Then that part is the easy part. They can quickly check the IP address of the Wi-Fi you are supposed to in, or the cell tower you are supposed to be connected if you stay in the location. So that's how they check. So what about you leave the phone inside, you just go out? Then what they do is basically the phone, they monitor your phone activities. So if your phone is not active for an hour or a couple of hours, they immediately send the alert alarm using through the app and ask you to push the certain buttons. If you don't, which means you are not with your phone. So if you don't comply with all the requirements, there's a possibility you could be deported. So this is the kind of level of contact tracing and monitoring, which is one very extreme end, and probably it's not realistic in most of Western societies. So this is my experience from South Korea, how they are doing. Next slide, please. So when we are talking about using the technology for contact tracing, it's really heavily depending on the smartphone technologies. So in the location positioning is concerned, either using the GPS or using the direct connection to the cell phone. So GPS itself, as we know, is not the most accurately located. But modern smartphone use, it's called assisted GPS, where the GPS data as well as the base station information, because even if we are not using the phone, always our phone is keep connecting to the base station so that the base station know where your phone is located so that we can receive an incoming call. So using those data, they try to get the location. But of course, as we know, the location is not very accurate. It could be within miles of within the coverage area of the cell tower. So that's not the most accurate. So next slide, please. So the other option is using the Bluetooth, which is the Google and Apple is being developed. So basically, what Google and Apple platform is, each phone will be assigned a certain ID. So every 24 hours, then within the ID, then within, my understanding is within 10 to 20 minutes, there will be another code will be generated from your ID. It's basically certain key encrypted, 128-bit key is generated. Using the key without revealing your identity, then you send out your own beacon, and then somebody nearby within Bluetooth communication range, if they two recognize each other, then it's called they two are contact. So in that case, when those two are contacted, that information, the pair, will be sent to the cloud. Then based on how you implement it, using that data, for example, one of them is positive, then that information can be allotted to the other person. So there are how the app is being developed, depending on how you want to use it. But this is the basically platform. So now, using this Bluetooth proximity sensing technology, of course, there are many issues. First of all, it could be, we are talking about contact really is within the 6 feet range with staying 5 minutes or 4 feet 10 minutes as the CDC guidelines? How is it? Can we get that level of accuracies? Probably not at this point. And if there is some glasses between, then there could be a false contact maybe generated. So there are more the improvement needs to be done, but this is the basic technology. And potentially under the future 5G environment, using the millimeter wave signals, the location can be more accurately localized. So that's the one promising technology we are moving toward. And next slide, please. So from the perspective of public safety is concerned, as we already know, public safety alerting system. So there is emergency alert or Amber alert is already there. But as we know, these are the simple short text messages. So text message is being sent to each cell phone. However, after the 9/11, Congress has approved, and now the developing nationwide broadband public safety network is being developed, deployed. Next slide, please. So right after the 9/11, Congress has approved the nationwide broadband network, and 2012, FirstNet has been established, and AT&T is in charge of deploying nationwide broadband network, and which is operation is under the certain organization. And under the Department of Commerce, the NIST is in charge of managing all the research development for the Public Safety Communications Research Division is in charge of developing the research, and GW is part of that research effort. So after the first launching the FirstNet 2018, about 2 years later now most of the nation country is being deployed. The broadband network is being deployed, but of course it was 4G LTE network, and now it's evolving more and more toward the 5G, adding more capabilities. So that initially this was solely for the first responders to use. As we all remember, right after 9/11, all the cell towers were gone, so the communication was a disaster. So in order to prevent that, something else, the extra enhanced network tried to develop. But now we are looking into the pandemic situation. This public safety network is one really good source to be utilized in order to deal with such pandemic cases. Next slide, please. So main issue when we consider the public safety or health services concerned, especially communication, the contact tracing is really based on the technology-based issues. And then there are two. So instead of the simple text messages, there can be more real-time video streaming may be very useful. For example, imagine an application just like a traffic navigator system. We are going from one location to another location. Then we look at the map, and then it will show you if you follow that route, there are lots of traffic, you want to avoid that. So what if we have that kind of app showing you are going to a restaurant. I want to go to the restaurant, but if you check around the area, then certain area, what about there are more positive cases, more contagious issues there, then I want to avoid it. I'd rather visit the other area, avoid a certain area, and so on. So of course, this is all if it's a lot of everybody, some data is available. People are putting their own information there. So that part is, let's already assume it. Then what can technology do? What can technology do is using that data, then here is some app, real time disseminating all those information. Then based on this, every individual user can make a decision of their daily life. So if we are envisioning that kind of direction, then now there are two issues. One is the coverage. So we cannot just serve only certain area. We have to provide the service to everybody in the nation. So which means even if a certain area where for example, in the rural area where the coverage may not be covered well enough, or at the edge of the cell, then your signal may be very weak, but still you need to get some service, even if you are in the location. Another second part is that kind of real-time data does require certain, it's called the bit rate. So you need to have a certain bit rate per second, certain amount of a bit per second. So if it's not, then basically the time, how long it takes to get that much data, that's the critical issue. So considering coverage and the actual flight time, which means the delay, considering two issues, the current 4G LTE technology may not provide that options. So instead, next slide, please. So as you can see in this figure, one cell tower base station sending the signal, it's called unicast, one at a time. So sending one signal to the leftmost cell phone, which is too far away, so signal is very weak. In the middle is a pretty good signal, but on the right side there is a building, so signal is bad. So next slide, please. So basically, such a unicast may not achieve the goal what we want. So we want to cover everybody within certain amount of with the bit rate. So next slide. So there's a technology under the 4G LTE, which most of the cellular operators currently available through the most of cellular operators, and where it's called two base station in this example. In other words, a set of base station completely synchronized manner, sending out exact same message to surrounding area, which means everybody around there will receive the message. It's called broadcast, so that on the left-hand side, the phone, two signals coming from two different cell tower, exactly same. So even if one is weak, the other is better. So they combine the signal, it can enhance the receiving quality. Same as on the right-hand side, when one is blocked through the building, since the other signal can help, so that phone can also have a better reception at that point. That's the basic concept of multicast. Using one is the cell tower send the signal, broadcasting, everybody receive it. But from the endpoint, it's not only receiving from one cell tower, but it's going to receive everybody participating in that broadcasting scheme, so that the receiving signal will be improved. So next slide, please. So clearly you see the big advantage of two. One is a resource, which means wireless spectrum will be saved because it will be shared by everybody around. Second of all, even if the user is having the bad signal when it's connected to only one cell tower, but since it will receive the signal from multiple base stations, the receiving signal will be significantly improved. Therefore, the coverage will be improved. Next slide, please. So this is the application scenario I just mentioned, that using there are big if, all users will submit their infectious status daily basis. All users will allow their device to upload their live location in real time, or allow complete tracking. And of course, we are assuming that enough of a population is sufficient users are there. Then using all those informations, then if the wireless technology allows such a massive amount of broadcasting allowed, then someday we may be able to get that kind of application similar to traffic navigator. So that's the kind of a vision we are looking at it. And next slide, please. So we have done some initial, basically this is the part of the research we have done for the public safety networks project, but as this COVID pandemic situation arrives, we start to look into different angles. So we have done some initial experiment and showing that with some baseline scenario, urban scenario, rural scenario. In each of the scenario, the multicast environment significantly outperform the unicast alone. So can you skip the next few slides? I'm not going to get into those details, but we can move on. Move on one more. Yeah, just let's stay there. In the rural area, for example, if the in the x-axis, if the required bit rate has increased, the unicast alone, which is the blue line, the coverage will be significantly dropped, while the multicast can still achieve good performance. So this is our initial experimental result shows, and of course there are many more to look into. And next slide, please. So in terms of the future direction of the technology, we believe public safety network is tightly incorporated in health system. Especially, there are many nice features available from the public safety network, especially LTE network toward the 5G network, and tracing, contact tracing is concerned. So many issues being considered, but our small focused area is really how can we achieve to improve the coverage as well as the flying time, which means the minimizing the delay. So we believe the multicast, the so-called EMBMS technology, is a very promising technology. So this is what we are planning to continue work on this area for a while. Yep. The next slide. Yeah. So we have last few years working with the NIST and continue to working on several topics, but this is one of the topics we are focusing on, which is the multicast research. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that can be really helpful for the pandemic situation. And thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Choi. I feel like we got two great lessons there in your recent experience in Korea. I can only think that it must have made Albert kind of cringe, you know, after discussing the issues with kind of comprehensive surveillance infrastructures here in the United States, but yet that comprehensive infrastructure that's been built in Korea has been so effective in countering COVID-19 that it really gives us something to think about, right? There's a real benefit to having that infrastructure in play, at least in the Korean context. So it seems to me we're gonna have some great discussion and Q&A around kind of the important cultural frame that these technologies are deployed within, and how we think about that. And then your second half of your presentation on a public safety alert system that you've been so involved in, you know, I find it interesting, and I mentioned this before in other panels, as we were organizing these panels, we found that many of our friends in Asia, in particular, I'm reminded of a conversation with colleagues in Taiwan. When they thought about COVID-19, they immediately thought of it in the terms of natural disaster. And it was their responsibility to deploy mobile location technologies in a public safety framework in response to a natural disaster, which is a very different way of thinking about it than we've thought about it in the United States. It's, you know, health biosurveillance and how that bleeds into law enforcement. So I think that's going to be also a very useful fodder for our discussion today. So thank you so much for introducing those very important conversations. So next we have Ms. Fane Greenwood, and if you're ready, Fane, we'll pass the mic to you.
Sounds great. Yes, I'm ready.
Great.
So yeah, my name is Fane Greenwood. I work on drone technology as a specialist. I'm really interested in how to use drone technology both efficiently and effectively for things like disaster response, transportation monitoring, crisis response. I'm also really interested in the ethical and privacy dimensions of drone technology. That's something I've been working on for quite a long time. And really figuring out how we can balance the many benefits of drone tech versus some of the negative downsides. And I think drones are also kind of a fascinating lens through which we can look at many issues related to privacy and location data because they are such kind of a hot topic. But a lot of what comes up here can be generalized to other technologies. So next slide. So I want to talk briefly about how drones have featured in the COVID-19 crises. And as you probably noticed in March and April, when the full size of the crisis was really becoming known around the world, there was a ton of drone hype out there. Things like delivery, you know, monitoring social distance, checking temperatures from the air, all kinds of ideas were thrown out there. And it's now July, and basically none of that's translated into useful COVID fighting strategies. It really, the hype's kind of died down. I think people are realizing what I think was, to me and others who work with drones, somewhat apparent at the beginning, which is that there are a lot of challenges with meaningfully implementing this technology for COVID-19 fighting and data collection. But next slide. So I think one of the most egregious cases of this relates to using drones to find fevers, which is something that was talked about a lot again a few months ago, and it's kind of died down a bit. I think it's still happening, but it's something that it's kind of fallen out of the news cycle. So authorities in India, Italy, China, other countries have been using drones equipped with thermal cameras to look at people with fevers. So more or lesser extent. There's certainly, I found news stories indicating that these were being used operationally. And the problem with this is that it doesn't work. There's a number of technical and ethical problems with this. And, you know, per Albert, what you were saying earlier, it's the exact issue of there are just no scientific validation. There's no proof of there's no evidence whatsoever that any of this is effective at all, which is a huge problem. Next slide. So some of these issues include distance. Standard thermal cameras that are used to screen fevers, they're only used maybe 1.2 or so meters from the subject, and they focus on the face, because it turns out that the area very close to one's eye is the best place to capture human body temperature with a camera. Now, of course, drones operate way further away from subjects than 1.2 meters, and actually FLIR, the manufacturer of these most popular thermal cameras used on drones, told me that they do not recommend using thermal cameras in this way. That is not something they recommend or validate. Making, the distance thing is bad enough. Drones are too far away from people to read temperatures in a meaningful way. Drones move when they're in the sky. Even when a drone is hovering in place, it's still kind of wobbling about a bit. And a lot of these things are being marketed as a way to quickly scan crowds, which indicates you're going to keep the drone moving. And that makes it even less likely you would have any hope of being able to accurately assess temperature. And there's also issues with calibration. You need to calibrate thermal cameras in many cases. That's really hard to do with a moving drone camera. And of course, there is, again, no scientific evidence that anybody is doing this in the field in any kind of validated way. And I mean, there are issues with thermal cameras with fever screening that are stationary and are close to the subject. So you can really imagine the technical issues will just compound if you're looking at using a drone to find fevers. Next slide. And some other companies claim they could use drones to detect human heart rate, breathing rates, and even coughing in people on the ground using computer vision systems. These systems don't rely upon thermal sensors. They rely upon analyzing aerial video to detect biometric signs. But unfortunately, all of the same problems apply. And these methods are even less tested in the real world than infrared screening is. I mean, one of the main companies that was promoting this technology, again, I could find zero evidence of validation in the real world. There's a ton of problems with accurately identifying these biometrics in people from a meaningful distance. So they had done some testing, but the testing was only from a maximum distance of a few feet away. Nothing like you would see with an actual drone in a real world setting. And actually, I think the town of Westport, Connecticut considered rolling this technology out back in May, but they retracted it almost immediately. Both from, I think there was some public outrage and disturbance over this, but also because I think there are just so many problems with these systems and so little proof they actually work, which makes it, in my opinion, extremely irresponsible to roll them out in the real world in a context that might have serious implications for people's freedom, their health, and also, of course, these systems can be used in incredibly unequal ways that reinforce racial discrimination, gender discrimination, class. There's all kinds of things happening here that can be exacerbated. Next slide. And again, facial recognition is yet another widely feared, widely ballyhooed potential drone use case that I can find no evidence of actual uses in the real world. A lot of theoretical talk about facial recognition drones in the context of like police drones. And I should also mention here that my work very much focuses on small civilian intended drones. I'm very focused on drones that are marketed to consumers that may be used in some cases by police forces, but these are police forces almost exclusively use drones made by consumer manufacturers. So they're almost exclusively using the same drones that civilians use for things like surveying, transportation infrastructure, for photography, for search and rescue, for humanitarian aid. They're all the same small consumer drones. That's what we're talking about here when we're discussing police drones, which is of course quite separate from military drones or even some federal government used drones, which are very different capacity, is usually much larger, can fly for vastly longer, have much more sophisticated technology aligned with them. So again, I also can't really find real world use cases of facial recognition of military drones either, but in the context of consumer drones that are used by police or by other, local law enforcement, the technology is not there. It's not anywhere close to there. Again, there's very little. I can find some technical papers and some evidence that researchers are working on this stuff, but there's a ton of challenges and related to, just like with the thermal drones, distance from the subject, the movement of the drone, the sensors you're using. And as we know, accuracy of facial recognition tech with people who are very close to you, who are on the ground, is lousy. There's been many documented cases of facial recognition tech being nowhere near as accurate as the advertisers claim it is. And of course, again, as Albert mentioned, these misidentifications become much more dangerous when it comes to women, people of color. Again, female people of color are much more likely to be misidentified by facial recognition technology. And basically every issue of a misidentification that would be applicable to a stationary camera would apply to a drone vastly more. But no one's even doing this in the real world, as far as I can tell. So that's an interesting, so that's something we need to keep ahead of and keep an eye on, but it's not really happening. But if it does happen again, with no sense of the accuracy of identification, we really risk false identification. And actually, there was a case, I think it's actually happened last year or a few months ago, but it came to light. There was a Black man in Detroit was indeed falsely identified by a stationary police surveillance camera as being implicated in a robbery. He was obviously not responsible, but he was wrongly matched with another person. So we really have actually had our first real world example of these mistaken identity cases using police surveillance. So it's all very dangerous stuff. Next slide. And here's another area where drones are being used by authorities, law enforcement primarily, using drones for public communication. So some models have one-way speakers that can issue instructions. The Chula Vista police in California back in April or May were actually using these talking drones to communicate with homeless people in settlements and remote canyons. They thought it was a good way to obviously, I find this very problematic, but they thought it was a good way to, avoid putting officers at risk by using the drones to communicate. I think, again, I spoke with them for an article I did for Slate. I definitely think there's a lot of problematic areas here. I think there's a bit of a blind spot among law enforcement. We're assuming people are much more comfortable with drones than they are. And I think the main real problem here is that the existence of these drones being used for social distance monitoring and for monitoring a protest, which I'll get into in a minute, they create an ambiance of surveillance, which make it seem like authorities are watching more than they likely actually are. The interesting thing about small drones is that they're actually really visible, much more so than police surveillance cameras, much more so than higher flying aircraft. A lot of police forces use manned aircraft like helicopters and even small fixed wing manned aircraft for surveillance, but we're used to those. Drones are kind of novel and they make us really think about the fact that we're being watched. And small drones are really not great tools for persistent surveillance, which I mean surveillance that happens over a long period of time. The most battery life you're going to get out of these small multi-rotor drones, you're looking at maybe 35 minutes if you're lucky. So that's not persistent surveillance as we understand it. And while you can tether a drone to ensure it can stay up in the air for a long time, then it's constrained to a very small space. So it's not really functioning. It's essentially an easy to move stationary camera. So they're not great tools for persistent surveillance, but since people don't know that, people assume persistent surveillance is happening even when it's not, which is a big problem. Next slide. So again, and getting into the protest, which was happened after the murder of George Floyd in late May in the United States, police have been really stepping up aerial surveillance of the protest movement. And that includes things like police drones, which many more and more police entities in the United States are acquiring. Lots of manned aircraft. Center for Border Patrol in the United States actually used a federal government-owned Predator military drone in one case to monitor protests in the Minneapolis area. And again, tons of manned aircraft. I think if you were kind of following the protest earlier in the summer, you would have noticed that there were helicopters, often multiple helicopters operated by law enforcement at pretty much every protest here in Boston. I was watching the ADSB maps or the flight monitoring maps and was really amazed to see they would scramble a helicopter for basically even really small protests, which I find really disquieting because again, it's really normalizing aerial surveillance. Again, this isn't just about drones, it's all kinds of aerial surveillance. And for example, in Baltimore, police are they're testing this persistent surveillance using manned aircraft over the city of Baltimore. They're flying these small Cessnas with super zoom cameras over the city basically every day for extended periods, kind of a test bed for persistent surveillance. It's really disquieting. And police justify this as the need for situational awareness. So it's a form of pre-crime monitoring in the sense that it's using drones to ensure that you're able to see what's going on in a way that others can't. And it's also disquieting because I'm speaking as someone who I'm a drone pilot myself. I have a journalism background in addition to the drone work I do. They're also dominating the airspace because journalists and activists use drones very widely around the world these days. They're a really popular tool for for journalism, again, for reporting. And if there's a police drone in the air, if there's a police helicopter in the air, I am absolutely not putting up my own drone, right? Because there's a major risk that I'm going to be accused of interfering with their drone or their helicopter. So which means in essence that the existence of this persistent kind of standardized police air surveillance means that they own the skies. It means that if you really can't benefit from using a drone to gather a different aerial narrative, as it were, because it is unsafe for you to put your own aircraft up there, which really kind of neutralizes a lot of the power of small consumer drones to give your average person the access to the aerial view. And that's pretty worrisome to me, because again, drone video has been used to really expose police abuses at protests. A lot of the activists at Standing Rock on Native American reservation, the Dakotas, were using drones to document some of the stuff, and that's becoming really increasingly hard. And of course, authorities are also putting up no-fly zones around protest areas to keep drones out. So that actually happened in Portland recently. So there's a sense of all these constraints on drone use by the public is concerning. And there's also very little regulation around police drone use. So 18 states at the moment have a warrant, require that you get a warrant to use a drone for police purposes for law enforcement actions. The other states do not require a warrant. I think there are slightly more than 18 states with some kind of rules around police drone use, but and the rules differ markedly from state to state. There's really no standardization at all. There's very little standardization around what happens to the data the drone collects. So I just wrote a story last month where police in Minnesota used a drone to monitor and search for evidence of rule breaking at a nude beach. So the beach was not officially a nude beach, and people would use it in that way. And the police used the drone to capture imagery of people who were not wearing tops or shirts, which is one of those, the argument is that they're in a public place, so they're entitled, they have an expectation of privacy, but that's not really how people operate. People don't expect to be monitored by a drone when they're at a beach. They aren't really expecting it even in the context of protests. So there's a lot of new expectations around privacy. There's a lot of Fourth Amendment issues. There's a lot of murky and unsettled issues, but I think the main takeaway is we really need much more regulation around what law enforcement can do with drones, but also with helicopter surveillance data, with surveillance data from manned aircraft. We really need much more debate and legislation around that. Next slide. And again, police, in terms of the public trust theme of this conversation, this is another huge issue, right? So police often are justifying using drones to de-escalate conflict with the public, and they don't really recognize in many cases that how the public perceives drones is really contextual. It's very based on the concept of privacy and context. So it really matters how you use the drone, how people see you using the drone. I mean, there's some public opinion research that shows that people are much more likely to approve a drone search and rescue than they're likely to approve of, a hobbyist using your neighborhood. They're much more likely to approve a search and rescue than police surveillance of protests. So they really need to come to this understanding that it's less about the drone as an object in many cases. It's more about what are you doing with it, and is there community consensus around this use case, and is there community knowledge of what happens to that information, that data. So those are all really important. And losing that trust means that you're going to lose access to your drone program if you're law enforcement, because people get really angry about drones. People get really unsettled by drones in ways that they don't about helicopters, in ways that they don't really about surveillance cameras. So they're very visible, and maintaining trust is essential if you're going to put together a drone program. Next slide. And again, to the other theme of this talk, bad drone data is incredibly dangerous, whether you're talking about thermal drone data to determine if someone's got COVID, or if you're using drone data to determine if someone committed a crime. So false positives and false negatives are immensely problematic. In the case of COVID, if you're using a drone to detect fevers and you don't realize that that drone is incredibly inaccurate, you might falsely identify people as sick, or you might falsely clear someone as healthy. And as we know that there's a lot of discrimination baked into these things, it's entirely likely that someone would be more likely to pull someone aside because they're suspected of having COVID if they are from a minority group or another demographic it's people discriminate against. And of course, there's also bad or confusing data. Again, it's open to interpretation, and that ambiguity leads to a lot of space for unethical use cases. That's something we really need to be aware of. Next slide. Overall, again, it's the hype monster. We're really in the middle of a hype cycle with drones. And again, I've been very relieved to see that a lot of the hype around drones for COVID has mostly died down. I was pretty concerned for a while there. I think not to say that there aren't still problems, but we really need to keep an eye on this. And I think my main message here is be very skeptical of any of these claims about using drones for COVID-19 or using drones for law enforcement purposes. We have very little real world evidence. We have very few test cases. It's all very experimental. And of course, that also means be suspicious of data that purported to be collected by a drone if it's used to, again, either ID COVID-19 or to ID people who have violated laws. Be very suspicious. And we really need to focus more on like the things we know drones are really good at. We know drones are great at making maps. We know they're great at collecting aerial data. Those are things we should focus on at the moment in the context of what's going on in the world. So again, they're not great at detecting COVID-19 from the air. And while they are pretty good at collecting aerial images of protest movements, they're also not going to be good at recognizing people's faces from the air. And we should also use this moment, this kind of newfound attention on aerial surveillance, on text surveillance to rekindle discussions about drones that really need to be taken up again about how do we regulate this stuff? How do we define privacy harms from aerial imagery and drones? They're really poorly defined right now. And we really need way more research that really attempts to define and articulate these harms so we can do a better job of regulating them while still maintaining access to this great technology. Drones are fantastically useful, and it would really be terrible if we allowed misuse of the technology and ethical abuses of it to take the technology away from everybody else. That would really awful. So that's why this is so important. But I think that's everything.
Well, thanks, Fane. You had some great turns of phrase in there. You're kind of warning that we've been creating an ambiance of surveillance, in a way normalizing aerial surveillance and other forms of tech surveillance, where it makes people kind of assume that things are being observed, things are being watched that may actually not be being watched, right? So that's both giving false comfort and maybe even false discomfort to folks just because of this overwhelming ambiance that's being set up. But yet within that, whether people are comfortable with it or uncomfortable with it, there's a lot of misidentification. There's a lot of bad and confusing data precipitating ambiguity into these situations, whether it's for policing, surveillance, service provision. So I think you pulled a lot of threads I'm looking forward to bringing out in discussion here. So thank you for that. Last, before we go into open discussion, we're going to hear from Professor Julia Stojanovic. And if you're ready, I'll pass the mic to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm ready.
Great.
Let's load the slides. Hi, everybody. It's no, the first slide, please. I'll tell you when to move. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. And in the next few minutes, I'll offer my thoughts on what I'm calling data equity systems. This is a slightly more general concept than what we have been discussing and focusing on here today, but I will do my best to ground the main points and the main thoughts under this umbrella of data equity systems in geography. Next, please. So I was asked to show a map to keep you all engaged, and so I oblige. Here's a map. It's a map of New York University's campus. So I teach at New York University, and what we have been speaking about and thinking about institutionally is how to reopen safely. And this is going to be the thread that runs through my presentation here to make things concrete. So once again, the campus of NYU. We, like many institutions, are planning to reopen in the fall. and we're grappling with how to reopen safely and responsibly. Next. Zooming into the map, we see that NYU has presence throughout Manhattan, mostly in Lower Manhattan, along with significant presence in Brooklyn. And what is shown here are just the educational buildings where we have classrooms and labs. But we must also consider, when we think about reopening, where the members of the NYU community actually live and where they would be commuting from when coming to school or to work. And we will be coming back to this last point in a bit, so please just hold that thought. And remember that I did show you a map. So next. So as we plan for reopening, and as we consider how to implement specifically data collection, data sharing, and data analysis mechanisms in support of these reopening efforts, we need to consider three aspects, broadly speaking, and in no particular order, really. So the first I'm going to say is ensuring the safety of everyone on campus. The second is being cognizant of the rights and preferences of individuals. And these include students, of course, but also educators and administrators and support staff. Especially support staff don't get mentioned a lot, but they absolutely should be mentioned quite a bit when we speak about these topics. And these rights and preferences pertain to their own data and to the engagement and participation modalities that these individuals want to have and can have on campus. And now the third point is that as we reopen, we should be creating systems that are efficient and effective at meeting both of these goals, the goals of safety and respecting the rights and preferences of people being impacted. And in all of these goals, we need to reason under uncertainty. This is both collectively and institutionally, and also individually as participants. And this uncertainty is what makes everything particularly difficult. And these difficulties are both operational, we don't know what the future holds, and also ethical. We don't know what the risks are and what the potential benefits are of the choices that we make. So let's go to the next slide. And here we are going to think more closely about data equity, and in particular in how it pertains to these benefits and risks that I mentioned. So more generally, I like to think about data collection, sharing, and analysis, specifically in terms of these benefits and risks, and in terms of who it is that reaps the benefits and who shoulders the risks. So who are these stakeholders really? We must be very careful to ensure that the risks are not borne disproportionately by some populations, subpopulations, and that the benefits therefore are not enjoyed disproportionately by some other subpopulations. And there is, of course, a rich history of imbalance of power in society that thus has been translating into disparities in this context. And many of these are also in the public health domain, the same domain in which we are operating today due to COVID-19. There are some stark historical examples that I won't go into. Kind of the most immediate one that comes to mind is the Tuskegee syphilis study. Please look it up if you're not familiar with it. It's an absolute disaster in terms of these failures of imbalance. So one set of issues was brought up by a student during a recent public conversation that we had at NYU about reopening. And that is that individuals with disabilities experience online learning very differently than do other students, but they also have different types of risks depending on their disabilities that are due to in-person engagement. We also need to think about how individuals who are experiencing housing insecurity are faring with respect to these benefits and risks. Are they actually able to productively engage, for example, in remote instruction? So kind of to generalize this, when we think about data equity, we should be accounting for the needs, particularly of marginalized communities, of communities that we don't think about historically and that typically experience many of the risks. So this thinking links closely with the notion that, again, that I believe should be central to how we're thinking about all of these systems, and that is this notion of data equity. Even in the best of circumstances, underlying structural inequities in access to healthcare, employment, and housing show up in the data record, and they are propagated through decision systems, automated or otherwise, to become reinforced by policy. And under the current regime of haste, we not only reinforce existing structural inequities, but we also risk introducing and normalizing new ones. The previous speakers all gave examples of this, ample examples. Right, so these, for example, might arise if contact tracing apps and certificates of immunity become the norm. And importantly, as is underscored by the pandemic, there are significant risks associated with not collecting and not sharing data. If we don't know how the disease is evolving, and if we don't know how it's impacting different demographic groups, for example, then we won't be able to control outbreaks, and we won't be able to mitigate inequities, and we just won't be able to reopen in any meaningful way. So difficult as these topics are, we must engage with them in a nuanced and productive way that will allow us to act rather than kind of sit back and just be paralyzed by this fear, and therefore essentially bringing additional risks to society by inaction. Next slide, please. So in my ongoing work, I focus on building data equity systems. These are systems in which data collection, analysis, and use are guided by the risk-benefit trade-offs to a range of stakeholders. These systems embed ethics and legal compliance by design. In the next few minutes, I'd like for us to focus on a particular aspect of this, and that is data sharing and collection as it pertains to our reopening efforts. We have different modalities of data collection, sharing, and use that are appropriate for different scenarios. And I will discuss these with you in a minute. But before we dive in, let us think some more about this data equity concept. Next slide. So what exactly is data equity? We consider 4 classes of issues. One of these we call representation equity. And this is increasing the visibility of underrepresented groups that have been historically suppressed in the data record. For example, confirmed COVID-19 cases require testing, and there can be racial disparities in both the availability of testing and the desire of individuals to be tested, which itself hinges on an abundance of trust or of distrust of members of a particular group in the healthcare system, leading to systematic biases in collected data. Albert spoke eloquently to this set of concerns earlier today. So trust, of course, is a central issue here, and in particular, it impacts how well certain groups are represented in the data. The second dimension we call linkage equity, that is facilitating linkage across data sets to ensure access to features that help expose and quantify inequity. For example, if features, attributes such as race and income are not recorded along with the data, then it becomes hard or impossible to discover systematic biases that may exist, let alone correct for them. So if we don't know what performance is of our metrics, of our solutions with respect to particular groups, then we won't be able to mitigate this, and we won't know that we are being biased. The third dimension is access equity, and that is about providing for equitable and participatory access to data and data products across domains and levels of expertise. For example, an institution's or a state's COVID-19 case data should be shared broadly, and I will speak about what some of those modalities might be for sharing in a minute, but it should be shared rather than held tightly by the state's own government, since combination with other sources can lead to better verification and greater insights. The final dimension I will speak about is outcome equity, and that is monitoring and mitigating unintended consequences for any groups affected by the system after deployment, directly or indirectly. For example, contact tracing apps may facilitate stigma, harassment, or retribution in the case of positive diagnosis, with disproportionate effects on marginalized communities. So this is another dimension that we should keep in mind here. Next slide, please. So as our first concrete example, suppose that our goal, and again, here I'm speaking on behalf of an institution such as NYU, is to help schedule when people can use elevators or access a classroom or a lab. And to motivate this, I'm showing you two buildings on NYU's Standen School of Engineering campus, the Brooklyn campus where I teach. And as you can see by the height of these buildings, you do need an elevator to get to a classroom or a lab. So back to our goal, we need to figure out who can take an elevator when, right? And so all we need to do in this case is to collect counts, to count the number of people who are using an elevator without any personally identifiable information, or PPI. Once we know how many people are in the elevator, we can tell a particular participant whether they should now go and try to take that elevator to get to class, or if they should wait. Participating in data collection here brings an immediate benefit to the data subject. They can now use an elevator or get a desk at a lab. Further, because this collected data is arguably not very sensitive, we can afford to very carefully share these aggregated counts to help the institution schedule things more globally at the university level. Not just at this particular moment whether I can take an elevator, but what's a good strategy for elevator scheduling as a function of demand. Next, please. A promising technology for data sharing, for sharing data carefully, is a set of techniques known as differential privacy, or DP for short. DP techniques aim to strike a balance between the level of privacy that we afford to individuals and the amount of utility, how correct the counts actually are in our example of elevators and lab desks. To protect an individual, we will be enabling through the process of data sharing plausible deniability. And to derive utility, we will learn something about a population, but we will have to add noise to be able to keep this plausible deniability. So next slide, please. Let me illustrate the spirit of DP, differential privacy techniques, with an example here. So let's play a game of truth or dare. I'm going to ask you a potentially incriminating question, and this is a yes-no question. So here I'm asking you whether you went out drinking over the weekend, and let's pretend that this is an incriminating question somehow, that you don't actually want to be found out if the answer is yes. I want to get a sense of the proportion of this group who answers yes, while at the same time not compromising each of the individual's responses. By giving individuals plausible deniability, as I will explain in a minute, we incentivize participation in data collection, because you feel like you're helping us gain insight while at the same time not putting yourself individually at risk. So the game goes like this. Answer the question in your head. Did you go out drinking over the weekend? And then flip a coin. You can flip a physical coin, or you can type into Google flip a coin, and it will give you this nice app, and it will flip a coin for you. If the coin comes up tails, then respond truthfully. This is denoted by C1 on my slide. It's the first coin flip. If it comes up heads, then flip the coin again. The second coin flip is denoted C2. If the second coin comes up heads, then respond yes, no matter what the truth is, and otherwise respond no. So this mechanism, these two coin flips, is a so-called randomized response mechanism that has been invented decades ago to collect some incriminating information about health status, actually, in the armed forces, I believe. So now I can observe the answers that you gave me. I can observe from this population, however many of you told me yes, and however many told me no. And I know, because of the way that the process is designed, that the fraction of yes answers is the fraction of the group who did go out drinking divided by 2. That's P divided by 2 in my slide on the bottom left, plus a quarter. So this quarter comes from the second coin, and you're just saying yes if it lands heads. From this equation on the left, on the bottom left, we can estimate the fraction of the group who in fact went out drinking over the weekend as 2 times the fraction of yes answers, that's 2 times A, minus a half. So I'm not expecting you here to follow precisely all the details, but the reason that I give you this is just to give you a quick kind of a feel for what these randomized response mechanisms look like. So this particular mechanism is actually differentially private. And the reason that I gave it here is because, first of all, I personally always like to learn something that I didn't know before when I listen to a talk. And secondly, it kind of helps to take the magic out of this differential privacy concept that we hear about quite a bit today. And I hope that you enjoyed playing the game. That's also important. So for more information about this and other technical responsible data science topics, please take a look at the course that I developed and I'm teaching, and where all materials are publicly available at that URL that's listed here, data responsibly, github.io/courses. Next slide, please. So now that we understand how differential privacy works, let's zoom out to why we want to use a mechanism like this in the first place. So we want to enable privacy-preserving data collection and data sharing. So how should we strike this balance between the level of privacy that an individual gets and how correct these counts actually are? One modality is to collect noisy data from individuals. And this is represented on this slide by drawing the boundary between trusted and untrusted right at the response to curator line. And we can do this with mechanisms exactly such as the one that I just provided to you. This is known as local DP, local differential privacy, meaning that we will know approximately, we as the curator will know approximately how many people are in an elevator at any given time, but it's going to be close to the actual number. Next, please. Another modality is to collect data from individuals precisely, but to add noise before we share that aggregated data. So this is something, for example, that the US Census is doing. They're collecting your responses precisely, but before releasing aggregate statistics, they add noise at that curator to analyst boundary. So this is another way to use techniques like differential privacy. Next slide, please. We spoke about collecting counts, that is, number of people in a classroom or in an elevator at a given time. As another concrete example, suppose that our goal is to collect sufficient information about people who are in the same room, like an elevator or a room or a lab or a classroom, at the same time, to be able to contain a future outbreak. If that is our goal, then we need to record a bit more than just counts. We actually need to record who specifically is entering and leaving the room and at what time. And this information is sensitive. Therefore, it's very important to limit the sharing of this information, to only share it on a need-to-know basis with specific accountability structures in place. For example, an accountability structure would be to allow a third-party entity to audit who accessed the information, when and for what purpose. We should also be sure when we design these systems to destroy the detailed records and keep only the aggregated counts as soon as we no longer need the detailed records. Another thing to consider is that we may need to only keep records if folks who are in the room are there for longer than some specific period of time. Like if they are in a room for less than 5 minutes and everybody is wearing a mask, we don't need to keep that information, right? So there's nothing absolute here. The message that I want to once again reinforce is that our data collection, data sharing, and data analysis should be in the service of the benefits, but with an eye on the risks. So if there is no benefit, then we should not be collecting it, right? We should really be discarding it. Next slide, please. As a final example, we may ask ourselves whether it's worthwhile to implement full-on contact tracing on campus. And here again, we is NYU. And to answer this question, we should again ask ourselves, what would we gain from collecting such fine-grained information of the sort that the previous speaker was explaining, how cell phones do handshakes, for example, right? So really, really fine-grained information. I'd argue that it's not much benefit, really, that we would derive. But at the same time, it's too much risk. So too much risk without much benefit. Please click. So next slide. Yeah, and this is because people spend a lot of time off campus, and click again. And they take the subway to get there. So we won't be able to get a clear overall picture of their potential exposure to COVID, and yet we would institute something very close to surveillance. And so, given these considerations, given that we only have a very local view of people's location, behavior, that does not cover their entire 24/7 life, I would not be in favor of such a solution. Next slide, please. Another crucial ingredient is allowing people to opt out of data collection and sharing, while at the same time enabling them to productively participate in university life, even if they decide to opt out. And this is something that Albert spoke about as well in quite some depth, where he discussed coercive opt-in practices. So this is certainly something that we need to think about and avoid. So what does opting in actually mean here? It means that we should support meaningful remote participation in courses, in our case, and meaningful social interactions between the students without requiring them to be on campus in person. And in that case, they would also opt out of data collection, sharing, and analysis. And this essentially amounts to broadening this concept of the campus community. And this is another point that our students speak very eloquently about when we discuss reopening with them, that they really need ways to meaningfully engage with us and with each other, even when they are remote. Next slide, please. So in summary, my recommendation is to work very hard, but also very quickly, because we don't have that much time, to identify data collection, sharing, and analysis solutions that bring tangible benefits and where we can have a handle on the risks. When we develop these approaches, we should be in close contact and consultation with the people whose data we are about to collect, to understand their opinion on the benefits and on the risks, and more generally, to create an environment of trust in which these data collection, sharing, and analysis efforts are not seen as a sinister social experiment, but rather as a piece of a productive approach to reopening that is to everybody's benefit. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julia. I mean, I love that you end it with, you know, we want to avoid having it appear as though it's a sinister social experiment. I think that encapsulates so much just in that statement there. Well, I mean, you brought so much to the conversation here. I really appreciate the primer on differential privacy. You're right. As we were organizing these panels, it came up continuously. US Census, some of the major platform companies, everyone who is trying to collect massive amounts of data to solve a particular problem, but yet wants to, you know, abide by the right ethical guidelines and principles. That seems to be a tangible, you know, kind of strategy for protecting privacy. And I'm sure it'll come up in the Q&A. So I think this is a good time to, you know, we prepared for the audience, we prepared a number of questions that all the panelists have actually seen. So I figure we should go through some of them, particularly in light of Julia finishing on the note of trust. Trust is hard to build, and it's just so easy to destroy, particularly in kind of the impersonal kind of digital relationships and using digital platforms. So building trust with citizens and consumers around the use of their most intimate data, you know, where they are every minute of the day, can be an enormous challenge. And technological glitches or procedure errors or, you know, perceived misuses of the data can create irreparable harm. How should governments and companies think about building trust with those citizens and customers whose mobile location tech they hold? I mean, that's a big question. Hopefully it's an open-ended question that lets you kind of approach it through your own perspective. I don't know who may want to pick up on that first, but Albert has his mic hot, so maybe I'll just pass it over to him.
Yeah, well, there was one part of that that really stuck out to me, which was the premise that governments and companies would be the ones holding this data, because I think that one of the key privacy safeguards in all of these different approaches is minimizing the amount of data that's held in the first place, as Julia was talking about. You know, really data minimization, and especially in the government side, is one of the most valuable safeguards we have. And you know, with any of the sort of tech-assisted contact tracing and exposure notification technologies that we're talking about, whether they're Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or a cell phone based or any other technology, absolutely none of them will work unless you have buy-in from the overwhelming majority of the public. And to get that buy-in, you would need clear guidelines on how data is preserved and how it's deleted. And I think, tools like differential privacy are incredibly powerful in providing the mathematical protection for that data, but it's also a very difficult democratic issue of how do you get popular buy-in for something that is mathematically so sophisticated. And even I know a lot of people with advanced degrees who don't fully understand how differential privacy operates. And so I think it's a strategy, but the most powerful one we have is to simply say that this data won't be held except where it is clearly linked to a beneficial use case and only for the amount of time needed for that specific use.
Thanks, Albert.
I have
Anyone else can jump up on that.
yeah.
Fane.
Okay.
So, let's go with Fane, then I'll go back to Julia.
Well, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I completely agree with that, and in my mind, really what we need is legislative protections, because it's very much a social and collective trust thing. In the U.S. context, we really lack a lot of meaningful data protection laws or ways to defend ourselves. As I've watched the social media companies, the big tech companies hoover up data over the past decade, I just have very little trust that anybody's going to self-regulate who's holding this stuff. And I'm especially distrustful of, obviously, distrustful of private companies and entities. And the main thing that would make me feel better, speaking for myself here, but I think others share that sentiment, would be stronger laws and regulations that would impose meaningful penalties and meaningful impacts on people who use data unethically. And those just don't really exist, unfortunately, to the extent they need to right now.
Great, Fane. Julia, yes.
Yes, okay. So to follow up on both of these points by Albert and by Fane, with which of course I agree very strongly, one other piece that we did not yet bring up is the competence of the operators of these data collection and data analysis methods, right? So very many of these methods are going to be predicting things. And prediction is bound to sometimes fail. We cannot foresee the future, right? And then the question becomes, who takes responsibility and who is accountable for these mispredictions that we make? Who is accountable for the mistakes? And a computer or a data set cannot be accountable. They lack agency, right? It has to be a person. So whenever we have these environments in which data is collected and then a predictive task is processing that data, when there are errors, the human operator has to be competent enough to understand what the process was. They have to be competent enough to endorse it, right? To take responsibility for these actions. And Fane at some point said that we should not be using drones with facial recognition because the technology simply is not there. Even if the technology were there, but we did not have sufficiently well-educated operators of this technology. And these are some of the cases that we see in policing, in the criminal justice, right? The conditions are simply not met for the responsible use of this technology. Technology alone is insufficient.
And if I could just quickly add on that, 100% agree. It took, after the Industrial Revolution, half a century to develop the liability framework so we could actually hold companies accountable through tort law for the industrial decisions that their employees were making. And I'm fearful that we'll see a half century of legal ambiguity on automated decision systems before we finally get the measures in place to hold developers, operators, and others accountable. But with regard to what Fane said on the legal side, yeah, that's something we've also been pushing strongly. And I think this also maps in nicely to the example that Julia gave of the US Census, right? The reason why the census is able to collect highly granular identifying information on everyone and then later on add in noise to that data set is because we have a federal law that for more than 50 years has said that it is punishable by, I believe, 5 years in prison to release identifying census data for any improper purpose. police can't get this data, not with a warrant, not with a subpoena, not with any other process. And if we are to if we really want any sort of mass data collection or data analytics to be a part of the response to COVID-19, we need to have equally robust legal protections against the misuse of that contact tracing data for any other purpose other than the public health response.
You're muted, Chris.
And unforced error. Hyung, did you want to chime in on this question at all?
Oh, I don't know. It's such a difficult topic. I don't know. I mean, it's like this kind of a situation. Just regular citizen, including myself, is really feel desperate situation. So there are people willing to sacrifice their privacy. Basically, I mean, personal information. If it helps for the public health management is concerned, people are willing to provide it. But of course, there are very sensitive issues. There are certain cases. So majority of the citizens are willing to provide their own private information, I believe. So we are really talking about certain small segment of the issues that needs to be really seriously considered, dealt with a really leadership level, I believe. So
We disagree. We have disagreement on the panel, and that is really great, I think, because otherwise it's dull. So I think that maybe in Korea there is a small section of the population that disagrees. In the US, it's very sizable, and it's not a random sample of the population. It's not just some lunatics who have conspiracy theories. People have reason to disbelieve the government's data collection efforts, right? And people, in fact, mistrust the government's data collection efforts, particularly from marginalized communities, for a good reason, right? So I don't think that this is an issue that we can dismiss as a statistical fluke. It's a fundamental issue in our society here.
No, I'm not saying. I mean, we can dismiss it, but I just happened to see the Google was it timeline reported today. They basically, without actively knowing to me, they really have a complete trace of whereabout last month. So detailed of every location along the time. So this is the kind of data already revealed. And for me, do I have to worry about it? At that point, I mean, at least for that part, I'm not. But I understand. I agree. I mean, there are. This is really serious, is because especially the government who's going to use what's going to happen, including the other country, including Korea. People worrying about. I absolutely agree. At this point, because of the pandemic, everybody wants to solve the issues, so willing to sacrifice certain things, but everybody worrying on what's going to happen, what government is going to do with the data they collected. So this is the really major issue. Trust is a really major issue. I absolutely agree.
Yeah, go ahead, Albert.
So I was just going to push back slightly to say that, the polling I've seen on this shows a majority of Americans actually opposed or strongly opposed to the use of this sort of tracking. According to a Washington Post poll from April, 20% of users definitely wouldn't use it. 30% said they probably wouldn't use it. We've seen low adoption rates in the majority of countries that have had this technology. And I think that, I do think that I personally tend to push back on the framing of utility versus privacy, because I don't think we've actually established that there is a countervailing public health utility for this data collection, but that we've only established that there's a clear privacy harm.
Yeah, before I pass it over to Fane, I just kind of point out, sometimes you hear a social cohesion argument, right? In Korea and Taiwan, there's kind of different cultural frame, but different kind of level of social cohesion than we have necessarily in the United States or some other nations. And I think it's also, things that you hear is, in Korea and Taiwan, for instance, they have a comprehensive response to COVID-19 where contact tracing technology is a piece. And that's born of previous pandemics with SARS, for instance, where they had an experience, it didn't necessarily go as well as they wanted. And there's been a lot of public deliberation and kind of open rethinking of what they've done and how they want to do it in the future. And in the United States, in a way, we're kind of walking into this cold. It's going to be interesting what the discussion is in the next pandemic in the United States based on lessons we've learned as a society. Maybe we'll learn no lessons. Maybe we'll come at it with the same visceral cultural assumptions, but sometimes learned experiences do lead to public considerations. I don't know. Fane?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you completely, Albert, that these discussions around contact tracing, especially in March and April, were very much around, oh, well, the predicating assumption was always that the contact tracing will work and be effective. And the question is really just, are we willing to accept the trade-off to get the utility of contact tracing? I think people have realizing more and more that, of course, that's actually a false frame. We really don't have much in the way of solid proof that the contact tracing does have public health utility, as you said, Albert. And therefore, the argument really shouldn't be, oh, do we want to give up our privacy for this benefit? We're giving up our privacy for an unknown benefit that, for a number of reasons in the U.S. context, especially, may not work very well. Not to fall into U.S. exceptionalism, I do think in this case we are quite different in our lack of centralization, centralized approach to COVID-19, and this cultural and societal factors. I mean, it's really hard, in my opinion, to overstate the impact of what's been happening since May, too, with police defunding protests, because so many people are now, because we're having this massive and desperately needed, might I add, societal debate about police and how much we trust the police. Trust in law enforcement is also very much, I think a lot of people are also feeling a lot less trusting of U.S. law enforcement than they did even a few months ago.
And so, not just because of COVID-19.
Exactly, right? Because of police brutality. So I think there's I'm someone who's followed data privacy issues for many years now, but even I've definitely noticed there's a shift in how I think, and which is, of course, made me feel even less inclined to be interested in any way, shape, or form giving any of my data to law enforcement, because I don't trust them. And I think again, societal trust is at a really low ebb right now, and that's just going to make everything a lot more difficult.
Right. Hyung, your mic is on. Did you want to comment some more? No. Okay. Well, this has been a great conversation. I'd love to move on to next question we had. And it's really, central to the data quality issue. We often, garbage in, garbage out. It's a well-accepted kind of aphorism within the technology community. In the context of COVID-19, false positives, false negatives in testing are an illustrative example. Given that such false test results will then be tied to mobile location data and the technologies that are tracking you within contact trace, if we implemented them in a contact tracing regime, how should we think about the ethical issues around data quality? When it's not just the issues of how good is the location data, but like you're going to be bucketed based on a test, and the test may be 30%, error prone. How do we think about those things? I mean, I know when I recently had a COVID scare or a potential contact, we went and took multiple tests just because we know that this test is 30% wrong and there's going to be multiple of us. How do you even personally de-risk what are imperfect data when you're going to have to suffer the consequences of living by that judgment, right? So I don't know, I kind of see Julia's eyes tinkling there. So go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, sorry. You need to call on others first sometimes also, otherwise I will lose this. Right. So I really like this question and also the way that you framed it, because you're framing this as a set of ethical questions, but they also are just firmly technical questions. And this question shows how the ethical and the technical cannot be decoupled these days, right? When we talk about data, when we talk about accuracy of prediction, when we talk about taking multiple uncorrelated signals to try and reveal the truth, if there is such a thing, right, with you taking multiple uncorrelated tests. These are all deeply technical decisions that we make and that we kind of hope that jointly will help us operationalize some of our ethical thinking and some of the values that we embed into these systems. So yes, we absolutely are going to make mistakes. The more uncertainty there is to the data, the less likely it will be useful. Absolutely, we have to have people making decisions, policy decisions, or even individual decisions, whom to quarantine, how to distribute resources, who understand statistics, at least at a rudimentary level, right? Or they need to have people that they can talk to and that to whom they can then explain what their questions are, and then these statisticians will translate. Because here, what we have built are these very complex human engineering kind of environments, right? Where machines, and by machines I mean data and predictive analytics and all of that stuff, and people have to interoperate so that people can make decisions that make sense, and again, that they can take responsibility for, and therefore people have to understand machines. This is really just down to, you need to understand what an error bar is, you need to understand what uncertainty is, and there is no magic. Your algorithm, whatever it is, it should not be telling you yes, no. It should always be giving you confidence intervals, and you should know how to read these intervals. And mistakes do compound in the worst possible ways. So if there is a 30% error in any one of your components, you can throw out the result, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's comments. I remember when I first ended up in the tech industry, one of the older, wiser technology veterans, he just said, Chris, technology is not magic, right? That was like, he felt the need to say that because it's just so easy to come to it with the assumption that magic is going to happen and things will happen automagically, and they don't. So Albert, right. I saw your mic go.
Yeah, and I agree with Julia. And I think this is so crucial because, as I touched on briefly in my presentation, with a lot of these contact tracing solutions, we're looking at using hardware that's already owned by the public, right? Building on their existing smartphones, which is baking in the inequality in smartphone ownership patterns. So, for example, those who make under $30,000 a year of smartphones maybe 71% of the time, and then over 95% of the time when people make over 75,000. And you see these same inequities playing out over age brackets based off of educational attainment, based off of race. And so what you end up is that you'll be creating this data dashboard that decision makers rely upon that's going to be constantly skewed by the data points coming from only a selected subset of the community. And we see a real risk that you'll reinforce health inequality because, for example, if you have wealthier white communities running exposure notification system more frequently, and you see more potential points of contact there, and you see more potential spread there based off of the system, you could easily imagine a scenario where decision makers are then over-investing in health resources for that community, not because of need, just because of how that need is mapped by the system. And so that's why I'm very skeptical of using an exposure notification says, even if I believe that the underlying technology was a suitable proxy for exposure, I would be very wary of running it on end user devices when we see this much variation in who has access to these devices.
Great. Fane.
Yeah, I just wanted to build upon what you were saying, Julie, about technological competency. And what you said earlier as well, I completely agree. That's a huge issue. And in the context of the fever-seeking drones, for example, one of my biggest questions was, how are you going to train law enforcement officers to accurately interpret this thermal data? And there's a number of examples of this in facial recognition. I've seen a number of news stories where police are supposed to interpret facial recognition as a likelihood of match, but they don't interpret it. They're interpreting as, okay, that it's a guaranteed match. The ambiguity is really not coming through to the end users of this technology. They're not understanding the ambiguous nature of these results, and that is going to lead to an equitable outcome. And I mean, that's obviously a huge challenge because it depends on who you're asking to implement. If you're asking, again, a police officer who is not trained in this stuff to implement, if you're asking a social worker, a public health worker, you're not going to have specially trained people, which means that if you're rolling out tools that really cannot be meaningfully used by people without special training, you're not providing that training, you're simply giving people a false sense of confidence, and it's going to create mayhem. So that's something we really, that training piece and that knowledge that technology is useless without a strategy for how you're actually going to train people to interpret that data. Because again, I work on implementing drone programs, and that's something we see all the time. Organizations buy a drone, they don't devote any time or energy to learning how to interpret the drone data. They don't really figure out a strategy for storing the drone data or using the drone data for decision support. And the drone ends up sitting on a desk collecting dust. Best case scenario. Worst case scenario is they keep on using it, they use it badly, interpret the data badly, which is also what we see. So these are the same, it's the same pattern we're seeing this COVID tracking technology, and it's definitely super worrisome. And also in terms of inequities. Another point I'd like to add, which is not super tech related, but is really meaningful, I think, is actually this is tech related. Google, during the early stages of the pandemic, Google was working to set up COVID testing centers. And they were requiring, I wrote a story about this earlier in the year, but they were requiring people to present ID to get tested. So, and also to have a Google account. So they were really mediating access to testing through the lens of these requirements that are going to leave people out. I mean, if you were an undocumented worker without a laptop, you don't have a Google account, you don't have a smartphone. How are you going to be able to get access to testing? So yeah, these are all these like tech blind spots that are coming up and are really being exposed by COVID.
Great. Kyung, do you want to chime in on this question, or should I move to the next one?
So while I'm listening to everybody's, it's all really important issues, but this is where we are. So what can we do as it is now? So for example, the testing result inaccuracy, 30% is unacceptable for sure. While we, the great United States, have to deal with 30% of inaccurate test result, while other countries can do much better. Isn't there something really somebody else has to take care of it? And then we try to combine the technology, contact tracing has to have a certain confidence of their level of test accuracies. This is a really sad situation. We will have to deal with that level at this point too. That's how I feel it.
No, I think it's an interesting, sometimes I feel like these conversations end up being, compounded distrust because of compounded technical, bureaucratic, legal, administrative failures. Sometimes if you replay the tape and you wonder, what if we had in the United States a meaningful, proactive, robust public health response? What if we had widely available testing, at day one? What if, contact tracing technologies already existed, had been kind of socially vetted, right? Based on a previous experience, there were strong public laws around it. Like, just makes me think that, like, in the United States, we've managed to enter this pandemic having done nearly everything wrong, and therefore it's difficult to have a meaningful discussion about how certain technologies might be used positively. So I take your point, and I kind of feel that frustration myself sometimes, and it's unclear how, it's clear that progress could be made, and how to make it is unclear, I guess. But I will roll to the next question, and I'll probably come back to you, Hyung, just because of the topic of your presentation. Even if we did everything right, geographic precision and accuracy of mobile location data can vary widely, whether you're traveling indoors, dealing with urban canyons, underground scenarios, even rural areas where the coverage is dicey or problematic. And of course, everybody's using different pieces of technology that require the infrastructure to have different strengths. This can create massive blind spots, inaccurate geolocation, and incorrect assessment of spatio-temporal co-location. And I think you went into that, Hyung, in your presentation. In that context, how should we think about the authoritative nature of this data when drawing conclusions with massive ethical ramifications?
So apparently there's a big effort is going on to really improve the accuracy of the location. So especially all the different layers, including the very low wireless communication using the millimeter wave in the 5G setting. So there are communication people looking into how to improve the localization, the location estimation. So again, this is all tied up together from the top level of health management is concerned. It's all part of it. So again, somebody in the leadership has to have a big vision to put the major effort, investment to improve that technology direction, and so that they can be really meaningfully utilized in these health management issues. So again, it's a lot of frustrations. I feel it, everybody feel it, and this is where we are.
Great. Fane.
And again, it all comes back to the societal trust question, right? Because I think, like in the Korean context, I think where most people seem to agree this stuff is good and useful, then I think it makes a lot of sense to improve accuracy. But, when you said that, in my mind as an American, immediately went to, oh, great, now the police will find it even easier to track down where that person lives. And it's just unfortunate that we have to think this way in the U.S. context, which is, of course, what I'm not familiar with. But yeah, that's, again, where my mind goes immediately, is that there'd be so many, we have societal trust in federal leadership, I would feel a little more comfortable, but that's just not where a lot of us are at. And I think, again, a lot of this kind of feels like, you can't out-tech yourself out of failures of leadership. You can't out-tech yourself out of structural social failure. We just can't create, it's that one weird trick, right, to solving the COVID-19 crisis. The clever technological solutions won't all work if leadership is completely failing to lead. And that's unfortunately, I think, where we're at in the United States right now.
Yeah, Julia, please.
Okay, great. So let me try to flip this around a little bit, and I'm going to put on my engineering hat firmly, which I never really took off, but maybe it was invisible a little. So rather than saying, and I think we all agree that there are lots of dangers here, right? We get data is faulty, we're operating these systems, people don't really know what they're doing. What would it actually take? What are some positive examples of where we have been able to use data and technology productively in the, the public health realm? And absolutely, technology does have a place in helping us find problems and helping us construct solutions. Absolutely, technology is not going to be the only thing, right? I mean, I'm the first one to say that we need to also have informed operators and informed consumers, etc. But two things I'll say. One is that in the medical domain, we have been more successful than elsewhere, for example, in the use of computational tools to diagnose diseases. And the reason for this is that, first of all, doctors have a code of ethics. Doctors are very well educated. They understand that the ramifications of a mistake are catastrophic for the patients and for their own careers, right? So there is this understanding of responsibility already. Some doctors, many doctors know statistics. And so this is a kind of an example of an environment where the stakes are high, but kind of the human operator really is very well educated and conscientious. So And also the patients, they have an immediate incentive, the benefit to them to share their data, especially if it's the case of a rare disease, let's say, is tremendous, right? So we have an environment from which we can learn. We can look at this domain and we can say what went right there, what went wrong, what were the difficult pieces. It wasn't the technology that was particularly difficult. I mean, it was difficult to build, right? But that's not the hardest part. It's really figuring out how to navigate this patient-doctor-machine interface. So that's one point. The second point is that absolutely we have to figure out how to use data and predictive analytics to help us mitigate and control an outbreak such as COVID-19. This is not the first time we're seeing this. We saw Ebola, we saw SARS, right? We saw the Spanish flu, of course, that was before technology, or the modern technology. But these things, unfortunately, will keep coming back. So we have to figure this out. And to start, I think we need to identify specific cases where data collection verifiably brings a benefit, where we understand the risks, and we can outline the scope of a technological solution. And in my 3 examples that I gave, the first 2 were of this kind, counting people in an elevator, or figuring out who was at the lab and may have gotten infected because somebody else who was also at the lab at the same time was tested positive for COVID. These are all cases that we know how to handle without a lot of exposure. If we take the right combination of technology and data and educating and, building trust and listening to people about their privacy concerns, this can be done. So we need to start with examples where, again, we have a solution or a problem that admits an engineering solution, where we can ask a question, we can design an experiment, a falsifiable hypothesis that we can then test and see whether our proposed solution works or it doesn't work. And then based on that engineering scientific argument, we can actually institute these solutions to great benefit in society. I don't think that benefit, risk, privacy, utility are false dichotomies. I think they are correct. It's just in some domains, we've not been able to really write down what is the utility or what is the privacy risk. But if we can write this down, we're golden, right? We have the scientific method on our side. So let's just think as engineers here. Let's stop pretending like these tools are magic or like they're evil, right? Let's think about how we don't produce snake oil. How do we produce concrete solutions that we can defend? And that's the first step. Start from the bottom and build.
Yeah, before I pass to Albert, I think that's part of the interesting thing in Korea and Taiwan. Most of the people I've talked to are engineers. They've been applying that scientific method within their social context, right? Within their institutional context, their legal context, but they've been working hard to answer those kinds of questions. And I feel like, at least in American society, we just kind of waded into it willy-nilly. Anyways, Albert, you had your mic hot.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of important threads here. On Julia's point, I definitely agree about sort of delineating the different use cases. And the way I tend to think about it, that we have purely medical applications of surveillance and technology and AI that raise a very different set of concerns from dual-use technologies that can also be co-opted by government, for policing, for immigration, for things of that nature. And so I think when you're talking about deploying data analytics, machine learning in trying to develop therapeutics and trying to analyze the actual way that a novel strain is operating, things along those lines, it raises a very different set of concerns and heuristics than when you're talking about spatiotemporal co-location, because that impacts such a broad array of privacy interests, but other civil rights interests, associational, free speech, right to travel, all of those things. And I would say that even if we were in a situation where we had a technology that was proven to help in identifying potential exposure, that one key differentiator between us and South Korea is that we lack the public health prerequisites to use those sorts of tools. So in New York, people are waiting more than 2 weeks to gain access to COVID-19 testing. People do not have reliable ways to isolate when they are presumed infected. Like, these are the basic public health measures that are indispensable to an effective response that we certainly have seen done very well in South Korea. And I think we do ourselves a disservice if we look at the value add of mass surveillance as part of a public health response without looking at all of the other forms of social investment and response that were needed to make that tool effective. Oh, you're muted again.
Can you hear me now? Fane, your mic's on. I didn't know if you wanted to jump back on that or.
Well, yeah, I just wanted, again, I agree with what everybody said regarding the need for, and actually another point there is that on the healthcare data, again, there's HIPAA in place. There's some sort of, there's a legal constraint upon the use of the data that it's not, might not necessarily apply in the case of these contact tracing apps. So that's certainly a level of uncertainty that would need to be resolved. But yeah, but again, it is really important to consider the social context we're operating in and the legal context we're operating in. And unfortunately, because we lack a lot of the basic elements we need to actually process this data in a meaningful way. So it's, you know, in terms of Maslow's hierarchy, unfortunately, we are lacking the basics right now, and technology is going to help us kind of leapfrog, unfortunately.
Area. So before I go to the audience questions, I've got one more that I'd like to get to. You know, in the world of AI, which I think several of you have picked up on, there's been a lot of wrestling with the issues of bias in the deep learning training sets. Training sets derived from large volumes of mobile location data, no doubt share the same patterns of bias. I think you guys have picked up on that, even if it just starts with basic ownership of handsets, right? So when using various, let me call them geo-AI methods, how can authorities and communities achieve some transparency into the sense-making part of the process, the sense-making that's being derived from this mobile location data? What other issues should we be concerned about? I don't know. Julia has that tinkle in her eye again, though, but I don't know if she wants it. Go ahead.
Yeah, or I can let somebody else speak first, but whatever.
Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah. So I mean, what does interpretability mean is a way that I might interpret, pardon the pun, your question. And this again depends on to whom you are explaining and for what purpose, right? So I do think that if we are to be successful, and I'm gonna kind of consciously put this positive angle on everything that I say now, because I want us to end on a positive note that, you know, things are possible to actually work. So what would it take? If things are to be successful, then we need to understand how to give members of affected communities insight into how decisions are being made about data collection and data analysis that affects them, and how to allow them to challenge the particular processes, the particular practices. And there's this confusion when we talk especially about deep learning. I think that because deep learning is just so complex, and even the designers of these algorithms can't really understand how they work exactly, that means that there's absolutely no hope for us of explaining to anybody what's going on. And I think that that's false. Our genetic code is also very complex. The literal program is complex. But that doesn't mean that we cannot attempt to diagnose and treat diseases, right? I mean, that would be ludicrous if we just gave up because we don't understand the syntax of the program. So there is really a distinction between kind of syntactic transparency that just says, I'm going to dump out all the data. Even if I don't care about privacy, I'm going to dump out all the code, and you go and figure out what this means to you. Instead, what we should be doing, and I agree here with Fane, that we need a lot of regulatory kind of muscle to be able to enact this, is we need to be setting up meaningful auditing, oversight, and public disclosure mechanisms for data collection and data use. And these have to do with things like fairness, right? I mean, fairness is a very loaded term, but kind of broadly speaking, I would say that we care about how outcomes are distributed. Are we giving more money to hospitals that serve affluent communities or less, right? And also about how the process affects different people. So there's this notion of procedural fairness as well as kind of fairness in outcomes. And we need to be accounting for both in the way that we are explaining. these fairness concerns affect groups usually, but then there are also individual fairness concerns, right? And these have to do with really me as an individual being affected, understanding how decisions are being made and why they're made based on this particular data set. Maybe it has errors in a way that affects me. So both individuals have to have ways to understand what's going on with their data and have to have ways to speak up, but also groups and representative of groups have to have ways to understand what's going on. So interpretability is a very difficult topic. It's a very exciting topic. I'm happy to talk more about kind of the progress that goes on today at this interface of technology and psychology and law and policymaking in this realm. But maybe the main message that I would want all of us to kind of leave with, and I know we're not ending yet, but it's something that I really want to reinforce, is that we each have a responsibility to try and understand what's going on. We have to think carefully about, so maybe it went over my head the first time I heard about differential privacy, but if I am to live in this society, if I am to complain about how government works or doesn't, I also have to take it upon myself to figure out what I would do instead, right? So please educate yourselves on these technological solutions. Speak to technologists, speak to your cousin who studies computer science. We can all explain things to you and we will do so gladly, but it's up to you, a member of the public, to understand what's going on so that you can productively speak up rather than just kind of say, oh, this is all broken and no surveillance. And of course, I agree, surveillance is bad, but what's an alternative?
Right.
It's on all of us to come up with an alternative.
I'll go with Albert and then over to Fane.
Sure, and I think this is a question that Julia and I wrestled with a lot when we were on the Automated Decision Systems Task Force for New York City, and I think this is, from my perspective, this isn't a computer science issue, it's a civics issue. In a democratic society, we have to have the tools to make sure that the governed understand how they are governed and can hold those making choices accountable. And I think that when we talk about the use of geo AI and talk about sort of countering the bias, it means all of the tools of democratic oversight that we see in other facets of government. So that means, yes, it means independent auditing. It means oversight hearings. It means civics education, where we can make sure that the public is better educated on how these systems work. It means a deep investment in trying to make sure that every member of our community understands the way that that choices about our communities are made. And it also means an ongoing national investment in this sort of AI explainability and auditing technologies that can provide some insights into how black box algorithms are operating. But I always push back and say that the technology is an indispensable part of understanding how AI works. These sort of technical solutions are important, but from my perspective, it's much, much broader than that.
Fane.
Yeah, no, I think this is all great insights. And, so in my work in the humanitarian technology field, we've been thinking a lot about data ethics in the context of disaster response and aid. So for example, a lot of biometric technologies, a lot of tracking technologies are being tested out on people in refugee camps right now. So which is obviously a pretty disquieting thing ethically. And during disasters, including COVID-19, a lot of technological experimentation takes place. We're calling that kind of humanitarian experimentation as this ethically problematic context where emergencies and need are used to justify rolling out untested tech. And I mean that because in the humanitarian context, we're really looking at this from a human rights frame. So basically, what are my rights as someone affected by disaster regarding data that concerns me personally? So in 2017, we released something at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative called the Signal Code, which is a rights-based approach to humanitarian information. And so we delineated 5 rights people should have over their data, including the right to information. And importantly for this, perhaps, is the right to redress and rectification, which is that we believe that people should have the right, for what you were saying, Julia, to contest false data about them. They should have, and this is also designated in GDPR, of course, in Europe. people should have the right to know what's being held about them. They should have the right to demand data be deleted or the situation be rectified in some way. And again, that does come down to legislative solution, but I do like this framing of thinking about data as a rights issue. And when you violate my privacy via unethical data collection, whether you do it on purpose or accidentally, you're violating my human rights. You're violating the human rights of people who are having this stuff visited upon them, who have less power than you do in society. So yeah, so that's the main thing I'd like to offer, is that thinking of our obligations regarding data collection, ethical data use, as really very much human rights issues that pertain to people's safety, their lives, and really important stuff.
Young, did you want to chime in on this question at all?
Yeah. So I had some chance to discuss with these people from Google and some other major technology companies. Basically, what they are saying, we can do anything in terms of technology-wise. So basically, if you know exactly what we want, we can do it. Technology can provide a solution, but much bigger picture here is really the policy level, ethical level, society level. So that's where every technology has to be driven by the society need. So including the bias in AI. We can throw out the raw data and then it can analyze and provide meaningful information. But final decision, action is done by the policy, which is made by the human being. So, in terms of this, the health management is concerned, any other need, we have to really look at the much broader perspective. But technology is just a part of the tool, and technology cannot be the hurdle. It will just help us the tool. So this is how we should view it.
Great. So a few questions have come out. I'll shift to things that have come in over the internet and through a few other channels. I see we've actually answered them for WebEx, but not everybody on Facebook is able to see it. So, some of these things are nitty gritty, but I think they all, it's useful questions, and they'd love some answers. Why are women of color at a higher risk of being misidentified, I guess with facial recognition specifically, than men? Julia, I saw you did a little text response, but like Albert may have, I think everybody could have something to add in there, but I think to a lot of people that are not steeped in the technology, they just look at that and go, wait, what? Like, how is that such a weird, specific thing that we need to grapple with? Julia, maybe, do you want to jump on that first?
Sure, but I already responded, right? It's a very very technical answer. There's nothing in particular about women of color that makes their faces more or less difficult for these machines to recognize. It's just we don't have enough data, and the reason that people of color, men and women, are recognized again with the lesser accuracy than say whites is because these machines are built and tested essentially by white men, and so the level of light that is required for you to discern facial features in a white face is different than for a person of color. So if we have more high quality data, it will mitigate this issue, and also if we start having a culture of testing accuracy, not just across the board, but in subpopulations also. And this is particularly important for small subpopulations. There are anecdotal examples of, for example, systems that Facebook has this system where they check whether your name is real or made up before you open an account. And it's a highly accurate system, but it makes all of its mistakes in the Native American category. Which you cannot really at all detect if you're just looking across the board, right? Because it's just such a small fraction of the population. So that's like one answer. And another is, now that you've gotten this technology to work, now I can fall back onto Albert and I say, now, do you really want to use it, right? What is the context of use?
Do you want it to work well? Right.
Yeah, and then if so, like, what is it gonna do? But the calculator itself is not broken. You just give it enough examples, it's gonna learn.
Maybe Albert and then Fane.
Yeah, I think that, we often take the position, this is a bit reductive and controversial, that all AI is biased. It's a question of just how biased it gets.
Or which
And
bias?
yeah, because
Right.
because there are countless subjective decisions that go into any automated decision system, into which training data to get, and how do you deploy the algorithm, and how the system is designed, who's on the team. All of these different factors lead to the propagation and sometimes amplification of existing human biases. And so, yes, training data can be one major factor. And, for example, IBM responded to the performance differential in facial recognition for women of color by investing money and getting more training data of darker skinned Black women and adding that and boosting their performance. But then groups like mine will definitely come in and say, great, now you've made it even more terrifying in a lot of ways to use this technology as a law enforcement tool, as an immigration enforcement tool. But I do think that, all of these systems, as magical as a lot of people think of them, they can be very fragile. They can have there can be systems that are incredibly accurate under most conditions, but, for example, with facial recognition, you have a system that will be accurate the vast majority of time, but if you alter even one pixel in a photo, it'll suddenly not see the resemblance to the comparison photo. So there are all of these breakpoints in this technology, and certainly with the human decisions that go into what counts as a suitable technology, what counts as a marketable version of AI. That is where you get a lot of the human feedback that amplifies that bias.
Yeah, and before I pass over to you, Fane, there's another question here that I think would be for you, but I think it gets to the larger point of like, these individual pieces of technology may not be bad, but the context in which they deploy are problematic. There's a question here about the thermal cameras you talked about, saying, they often do work at like 1.2 meter distance, but then beyond, some specific distance, they don't. So whether it's facial recognition or, a standoff thermal sensor, all these things have some utility and some value, but then when they're, out of the right context, either the data quality itself or the quality of the underlying training data may not be useful for the context in which the sensor was applied in the first place. So I don't know, just to add that on to you, Fane.
Yeah, and I saw that question, and I think, again, because I went through some of the FLIR camera documentation, some of the manuals for these cameras, and the recommended, even the 1.2 meter standoff at the airport, I would be somewhat suspicious of even a stationary camera being used at these longer distances in an airport. And again, coming to our talks about our discussion of implementation and training, who installed that camera, who's interpreting the data, are those people actually doing it right? Is the camera, did the airport install the camera at the proper distance? Those are all very valid questions. It's entirely possible that that airport camera is not all that accurate either. So I imagine a drone camera would be even less so. And so, yeah, I think, and then to the earlier discussion about, women of color, Black women, and bias facial recognition. Again, this all also comes down to the need for diversity in technology in the utilitarian sense. Beyond the fact ethically it's the right thing to do, it's also the right thing to do because if you have a very homogenous group of people designing technology, working on technology, they're going to have ethical gaps, they're going to miss things. Risks are not going to occur to them because they're going to apply to them personally. And you can really insulate yourself against these problems by making sure you're bringing in as diverse a number of voices and as possible. There are things that I am guaranteed to miss due to where I am positioned in the world that someone else will pick up on, and that's an incredibly important part of building and designing technology is that diversity.
Young, do you have any thoughts on this question? Okay, so I'll move on. So we have another question in from Facebook. Are there any concerns that we talked about differential privacy in the context of the census. So are there any concerns that the census's introduction of differential privacy will obstruct data accuracy for public advocates and academics, while the government and big tech companies will somehow retain the granular data? I think there's kind of two questions in there, but Albert, your mic's hot already. You win. You hit the buzzer first.
Yeah, I definitely want to highlight the scholarship that's been out there on the possibility that differential privacy in the census will mask the experiences of certain minority communities. Mutale Nikande at Harvard did a conference on this last year. There have been a lot of folks looking at it because when you're using differential privacy models, you can end up in situations where you're getting, at a lot of the larger questions that the census will aggregate. But for example, when you're looking at representation of incredibly small communities within a state, then you could end up in a situation where they effectively get erased. And so that's one concern. But as far as big tech companies getting that's not the case. This is information that would only be held by the census for, I think it's 70 years, 80 years, something like that. And you wouldn't have access by private companies. So Julia, if I completely messed up the differential privacy analysis, please set the record straight.
No, absolutely. You are absolutely covering it correctly. I think the big point here is that in technology, it is never the case that one size fits all, right? So it's never quite as simple. All models are wrong, some are useful. Different models will be useful in different contexts. This is like a more general statement of all AI is biased. So with differential privacy, I think what will make or break our ability to be comfortable with the use of this technology by the census and others is whether we as members of the public are able to understand sufficiently well how these trade-offs are set so that we can speak up about where we think there should be more precision. So for example, for redistricting, we really want data as precise as we can get, and where we can tolerate as a society more noise. So there's this magic parameter in these differential privacy setups called epsilon that just tells you how privacy preserving you are, and the more privacy, the more noise, the less utility, right? So absolutely, we as the people should be deciding what the rules are. And that's for everything, including also how these trade-offs are made by the census, right? So at the moment, the census is making these decisions. They are working very seriously and thinking very hard about how to help members of the public understand these technical details and how they can really participate in the debate. But I don't think, on the other hand, that there really is a choice. I personally think, and many will disagree, that the census, given the current legal requirements, has to add noise in a principled way, and so they have to use differential privacy. Again, there are different readings of this by different people, but that's my point of view, is that we need to use it, but we need to enable members of the public to understand what the rules are, so that they're not hurt, but that they benefit.
Great. Fane, your mic's on. I didn't know if you wanted to respond to that
No,
also.
I think that's all. Yeah.
Okay. So I've got two more questions, and we can treat this as a lightning round or whatever you want before we wind up. Maybe give everybody a little time back in their afternoon. So one is kind of a standing question that's come up in a number of our different panels, and it's about this kind of vast marketplace, kind of gray market of mobile location data that's out there, collected by a host of different apps and different companies, and it's aggregated, sometimes anonymized, and then resold. And that's kind of going on while others have been thinking a lot about the ethics of data reuse, right? We talked about limiting the amount of data, how long we keep the data, only using it for its original purpose. So what are the ethics of data reuse? And this may be a very American situation, but with all of this different data out there and our ethical guidelines saying, anonymize it or aggregate it, once you smash a certain number of different data sets together, there's no such thing as anonymity, right? There's enough opportunity technologically to de-anonymize. So given that that's kind of this reality, or maybe emerging reality, or maybe in a reality we want to go away, here, at least in the United States, how do we think about that when these are data sets that someone can just purchase and drop into their big data system because it's legal, those have been anonymized. Everybody followed the original ethical guidelines. Well, let me stipulate that they probably, they may have. How do we think about that, Albert?
We try to outlaw it. I mean, like, I'm just speaking for myself. I mean, right now I helped author a bill that would outlaw the use of geolocation data by police in New York State, whether they purchase it from a data broker or whether they get it by use of a court order. It just to say that it is not permissible in a democratic society for this sort of information to be used by police departments. And I think that we're at a moment, especially in the U.S. legal context, where we've allowed the fiction of terms of service to, govern our discourse for far too long. And we're going to see a lot more laws at the state and local level, and eventually the federal level, that simply say it is not ethical or legal to use this data, even if you had someone check a box, 13, steps before this in the aggregation process.
Great. Fane, I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, I just wanted to voice my complete agreement with that. It should not be legal. It should be illegal. We should not be relying upon companies and other users of the data to self-regulate, which we have done for quite a long time, and it's obviously not working. And yeah, it's not ethical. It shouldn't be allowed to happen, and that's really about as complex as I think it needs to be.
Hyung, did you want to chime in on this?
No, I think I'll just pass it.
Okay. And Julia?
It might be the only question on which I'll pass.
Okay. Well, so I want to end with, a little hopeful toward the future, but, I have teenagers. Many of us have children that are born as digital natives. They have these phones. They think it's perfectly natural that, they should know exactly where they are all the time. They should be able to see over the horizon to faraway places just by looking down at the palm of their hand. So the cultural assumptions that the next generation has around location, around privacy, around the quality of their data are kind of different from what I would have grown up with. I didn't grow up with a cell phone in my hand. I didn't have digital maps available to me. As soon as I walked out of the house, as long as I was back before sundown, nobody really cared where I was, and they had no real way of finding me. So given that many of these burdens, these challenges are not going to be faced, necessarily by us, but by this next generation that's coming up with a different set of cultural assumptions around this technology, what's your advice to them, or what's your, what do you think they should be thinking about, and maybe what should we be educating them about? I'll go to one of the professors first. I don't know. Do one of the professors want to bite on this?
I can.
Go ahead, Yo.
Yeah. Well, actually, I have a question for you. So your experience with your children, are they very are they aware of the privacy issues, the security issues for those teenagers?
Yeah, I mean, I think, they read the full Reddit review of the TikTok app and all the surveillance data that's streaming off of it, and they keep using TikTok. And so I look at that and I say, they get value out of TikTok, that whatever cultural value they get out of it, and they don't see that they have anything to lose, even if they are 100% surveilled. And I just look at that and I say, fast forward 5 or 6 years, when you have a credit score, and when you have assets, and when you have salary, and, when you have a physical, premise that you want to secure, and you worry about the safety of your family, will you change your worldview? And I suspect the answer is yes, right? But that's this interesting educational conversation you have with your kids. You go, I know you don't care about it today, but you need to gird your loins. You're going to need to prepare for a different future when you graduate from being an adolescent to an adult with assets who can be arrested and over-policed in new and interesting ways. So I don't know if I answered your question, Young, but
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with you. I mean, we as an adult and educator, we need to have a conversation with the young people about the what could happen in the future down the road. Because right now, I understand they are not really care about those issues because most of the app these days is they require you provide all the personal information. So I think it's really important for us to be responsible with the young people.
Great. Julia, our other professor.
Your other professor, and I have a 7-year-old, so he doesn't yet really use these devices quite as much. But I'm very naive in that I think I'm a hopeless optimist. So I think technology is nothing special. It's part of society, right? So when we teach our children, we should just teach them to be good people and to change society in such a way that data is not seen as a liability, that your existence in the digital realm is not, again, someone's sinister experiment watching you and trying to figure out how to disadvantage you. I think that we will have with the next generation an even better chance of building a society where things are more harmonious. And I realize that I'm saying this, despite the federal climate, despite what we're seeing here with COVID and with kind of the very inadequate response that our government is bringing. But I'm hoping that, again, our children will be better than us and that they will deserve a better society and a better government by being better. And so scaring people I don't think is the right tactic.
Great.
Yeah.
Fane.
Well, this is a funny one for me because I'm a millennial, so I was in that first generation. I was in that one of those generations where we were the first generation, I think, to be called digital natives. And we grew up hearing about how our Facebook accounts and our MySpace accounts were going to be used to ruin our lives when we got jobs, which is not entirely untrue. But I do think people, honestly, I would actually really defend teenagers and other young people on this. And I've actually done some digging into some of the research that exists out here. I think they're pretty darn aware of the privacy violations, but as you saw with your kids, they're aware they may be making different calculations. There's some research that shows that younger people, and I think I would include myself here in some extent, are particularly prone to looking at kind of privacy helplessness in the sense that they know they're being surveilled, they know it's problematic. They don't think there's a heck of a lot that they can currently do about it. They don't necessarily think that individual choices that they would make have a huge impact. So I think it's a lot more, I don't think it's a matter of ignorance in many cases. I really don't think it is. I think it's a matter of they're not sure what agency they have.
Right.
The utility of the technology outweighs the downside. But I do think there's also, in terms of age-based stuff, remember, we have a lot of evidence that in terms of online disinformation, older people are much more vulnerable to that, younger people. So there's a lot of technological education that we need to do, but it definitely should not just be directed as telling young people what they need to know. I think there also needs to be concern about how age works across the differential. Like, what are the risks to seniors? How do they differ from the risks of young people? But again, the narrative often becomes young people aren't aware of the risk. I'm like, yeah, they are in many cases.
Yeah. No, I think, before I pass it over to Albert, I'll just say I went to the Lafayette Park protest with my older daughter, and, the same girl that doesn't care that TikTok is just sucking everything off of her device. She had the full Instagram kind of instructional on how to set the configurations on all your tech to limit police surveillance on you as a protester. So, I mean, she's definitely thinking about it, but it's kind of like, transactional and content, related to certain contexts. But anyways, Albert.
Yeah, I think that goes exactly to the point I wanted to make, which is that in the work we've done, we've seen that younger users, especially Zoomers, they actually have a far more granular sense of privacy with online interactions than a lot of older users, and that they, yes, they may be fine with the sort of data aggregation that you see through TikTok, which, to be frank, isn't that different from what you see with Facebook. But as soon as they are told that maybe their parents are going to see all that same data, they become a lot more privacy protective. The same goes for the police or for other government agencies. So I do think there is a very nuanced approach to privacy that may not be where you may have a sense of that privacy helplessness when it comes to corporate data collection, but you see a lot more resilience in opposing government data collection, police data collection, and preserving facets of privacy going forward. I do think that, quite frankly, as someone who tries to pass laws against surveillance, the only reason we've seen the sort of success we have in recent months, it's because of the young people who've been taking to the streets, who've been raising up their voices, who've been opposing the sort of draconian surveillance that's gone unchecked in New York for far too long, and who are pushing truly transformative changes. So I do think that the next generation will be a powerful force for progress in this area.
Well, that's wonderful. Well, I really appreciate kind of the wisdom you've given on that last question, kind of the positive ending to the discussion. This has been a real honor and a pleasure for me to have all of you with us today to broaden our horizons and give us more depth on this really complex set of issues. So I'd like to kind of finish by thank our panelists, Mr. Albert Fox-Khan, Dr. Hyung-Ah Choi, Ms. Fane Greenwood, and Dr. Julia Stoyanovich for joining us today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules. I'd also like to thank the Henry Luce Foundation for sponsoring this series of Blue Ribbon panels and our Location Tech Task Force. Without their support, we would not have been able to convene such bright lights on these important issues of the day. And I'd also like to make sure that those of you in our audience today know about our upcoming events. This is a series of events that we've had. I think this is the 5th of our task forces. And we've also had a series of leadership spotlights. So coming up, we have some additional events. One is actually tomorrow on digital contact tracing tools, featuring the lead researchers at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. That'll be a spotlight hosted by my colleague, AGS President, Professor Marie Price. And then next, I guess a little more than a week from now, we'll have another spotlight that Marie will be hosting on technology and LGBT location privacy during COVID-19, a conversation with Mr. Victor Madrigal-Borloz from the United Nations. So I encourage all of you to tune in for those, but also look into our previous panels that you may not have known about. Share them with your friends, spur some discussion, and please, if you have thoughts and feedback, we would love to receive that from you. So thanks again for joining us today. We appreciate your being part of this conversation, and we look forward to seeing you again out there in cyberspace. Thank you very much.
Great,
Thank
thank you.
you.